The Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Welcome back to Liberty Mail. I'm your student host, Katie Kenline, and I'm really honored to be joined today with a special guest live at Grove City College. We have former governor of the great state of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, here with us. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
It's really great to have you on campus for the Reagan Lecture. You are now serving as the president of YAF, of Young America's Foundation, since 2021. Is that right? Okay.
That's exactly right.
And tonight, he's on campus to be talking with Dr. Paul Kengor about the Reagan movie, the movement, the legacy. Would you tell us, for people who aren't familiar, listeners, just some of the work YAF does? It's an incredible organization.
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to go to the Reagan Ranch that YAF owns in California. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you're doing?
Well, YAF.org if people are interested, or ReaganRanch.com. We made it easy for people who like the Reagan movie, like the Reagan Ranch. It actually so perfectly tied into Ronald Reagan, not just because we own and operate the ranch that the president had, the old Western White House. In fact, all the scenes of the president outside on horses or out at a ranch are all filmed. I was there. It was actually done the first week I was president at Young America's Foundation. So you can see it takes several years for a movie to come out. But we're proud to do that. I was just out there a few weeks ago for a high school conference and a middle school expedition. We frequently have college conferences there, as we do in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere around the country. But it's perfect because the group itself, YF, started at the home of William F. Buckley back in 1960 of all time, long before I was born. And a couple years later, Ronald Reagan, who was just a former actor at that time, head of the Screen Actors Guild, but a intriguing conservative to be, got involved as a part of our national board and eventually became the chairman, the honorary chair of Young Americans for Freedom, which it was called at the time. And so we've had a very close connection with the president. When he was in office, all 8 years, our National Conservative Student Conference was actually held at the White House with President Reagan. He addressed us for years after. And, of course, in 1998, when they were going to sell the ranch, we stepped forward and said we would pay. Back then, it was about $4.5 million. And the nice thing about that, it actually paid for his care, kept him in his home for the rest of his life. And in turn, Mrs. Reagan put everything back in. So as you saw when you were up there, the house is filled with everything they had. Their clothes are still there, their boots, their riding gear, you name it. Oftentimes, I had someone just a few weeks ago say to me, I feel like I'm almost invading their privacy.
Wow.
Because it's so personal in there.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. So I read online that you were able to meet President Reagan very early on in your life. Would you tell us your Reagan story? I know many of us, he's inspired us, but you have an incredible story of becoming governor of the state of Wisconsin, similar to President Reagan becoming governor of California. Could you tell us your Reagan story? Yeah,
well, I came of age under Ronald Reagan. So 1976, when he was running against then incumbent Gerald Ford, I remember as a kid, I was 8 years old, my dad and I watching the convention, and I still remember to this day my father saying, that's the guy who should have been the nominee.
Wow.
As it turned out, God's plan, the divine plan, DP as Reagan would call it, was for him to run 4 years later and win. I was a 12-year-old. My dad was a pastor. I still can't believe it. We lived in a parsonage, and I don't know how my parents let me get away putting up a sign the handwritten sign that said, why not an actor for president? We've had a clown for the last 4 years. Probably was a little over the top for a kid that age. But I loved President Reagan. I became of age with him. My brother and I had tied yellow ribbons for 444 days around an oak tree in front of our house, not just because there were Americans held hostage in Iran, but because one of them was from Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Kevin Hermaning. He was the youngest a Marine that had just been stationed there. So it was very personal to us. And so when he became president, it was just so transformational. Now, in 1985, just to correct something that's on the internet, I don't know where it was, some reporter down the line said that I personally met him. We were supposed to. I went to a program as a kid, like a lot of kids do, Boys State and Girls State. I went to Boys State in Wisconsin, and that summer I was selected to be one of two young men to go to Boys Nation, where we were going to meet President Ronald Reagan. And that week he was in the hospital for pull-up surgery. And so we drove by. He waved at us out the hospital room or out the window that was up there, but we didn't actually get a chance. But nonetheless, with or without that, just his time. And I remember when the space shuttle crashed, how touching it was, and he was really our not just the commander-in-chief, but he was kind of the like a grandfather wrapping his arms around America, telling you you're going to be all right. The comforter-in-chief, as some called it at the time. I just saw him as probably more than anybody other than my own parents. He influenced not just who I am as a conservative, but as an optimist, someone who believes in the. That's why I love the ranch. Wide open spaces totally embodies his sense of optimism for America, wide open, untapped potential. And that was something that affected me, even in my own case, then later running for office and being focused. One other quick story is at the Reagan Ranch. That's up in the mountains, but there's a center down below in Santa Barbara. And because I loved Reagan, even got married on Reagan's birthday, as crazy as that sounds, the year I was first elected, I'd taken on some big, bold reforms. Some of the liberal groups didn't care much for that nationally, so they sent as many as 100,000 people into our capital. And I remember between those riots, which eventually eased down, and a recall election the next year, ironically, on June 5th, which was the day 8 years before Ronald Reagan had passed away. So he was married on his birthday, one on his eternal birthday.
A lot of connections
right?
here.
I mean, none of which was planned that way. But I just remember that time between Young Americans Foundation asked me to come speak at the ranch. And I took a tour before I went up there, and there was a brand new exhibit on the third floor called The Critics of Ronald Reagan. And it was all these media types and politicians from the past who attacked Ronald Reagan for the things that he did. And it was so powerful for me to see at that time, and for my wife, Tonette, to see, because rightfully so, today, Reagan's beloved. He's the most popular modern president out there. But at the time, when he was president, he got plenty of grief from the media. He got many of the attacks that we see today in politics. But he persevered. He stayed focused. He stayed a happy warrior, which is a good lesson for me and now for kids. And he got the job done. And the reward was that his reforms worked. And that's what we did. We kept plowing forward and ran through the tape. We got the job done. And today in our state, the reforms still work.
Wow, that's really great. And I think watching the movie and all these phrases, I was in a multi-generational theater, and many people there remember the time and the movement. But I think even for all of the students who were there, some of his lines are very touching and inspiring. What are some of your favorite just Reagan stories or just phrases he would often use? You've already used many of them, but... Well,
phrases or even, again, think about something that happened just this last week. So Sunday was the 60th anniversary of a speech he gave right before the 1964 election. Again, not only before your time, before my time. And not that much before, but before my time. So he gives a speech on behalf of then U.S. Senator Barry Goldwater, who was no way at that point was he going to win. He was so far behind the polls. Most politicians went and ran for the hills. But Ronald Reagan not only spoke briefly on behalf of Senator Goldwater, more importantly, he talked about, in a speech we now call A Time for Choosing, he talked about what it meant to be a conservative. And there's one particular story that was so powerful then, but I would argue is as relevant today as it was the day he spoke it. He told a story of two friends of his who were businessmen who got to know another guy who'd just come to America. He was a refugee from Cuba, so he fled communism. And these guys are talking to this guy who comes from communist Cuba, which is still the case today. And they all kind of laugh and say how lucky they were to live here in America, to be born and raised in America. And the Cuban refugee looks him in the face and says, "What are you talking about? I'm the lucky one. I had somewhere to go to." And in that story, Ronald Reagan looks at his audience and says, it's such a vivid reminder that if we lose freedom here in America, there's nowhere else in the world to turn to. And that was a powerful point on October 27, 1964. I would argue today it's as powerful, if not more so, when you look at Cuba and Venezuela, communist China, heck, Portland, Seattle, Chicago, Washington, D.C. We can see what happens with progressive, Marxist, even communist ideas. They haven't worked at any point in the past. They're not going to work here. But that's really what's at stake. The difference between, are we going to embrace, as he said in that speech as well, the founder's idea of self-governance, or are we going to put our belief in the government?
Yeah, no, that's really. I always love the I'm here from the government. I'm here to help,
Right.
which is
the most dangerous words in American and in the English language.
Yes.
I'm here from the government to help.
yes. No, it's. What would you say to you? We're talking about optimism and how you're an optimist, and I think I would say I'm an idealist, and I love many of speeches written by Peggy Noonan. Her books have really inspired me,
Yeah.
and that she helped write that Challenger explosion
Right.
speech. But many people will say, "Oh, we're in a different time right now." The Reagan. We did an episode talking about some critique of reacting to some critique of the movie from Rotten Tomatoes, and just going through. Many people were saying, "Oh, this era's over," and this is just people who want to relive the glory days. But what would you say now to the moment we're in, that from an optimistic perspective of where's the movement at now?
Well, I think it's important. He said it then. He particularly said it in his farewell address in January of 1989. We need to appeal to our higher calling, our higher aspirations. I think that was true then. I think it is true now. I don't buy the idea that that's past. I think it's sometimes a little bit harder because of the world we live in and social media. Although it's really important to remind people that, even a few years ago when they were talking about then Twitter, that the Pew Research Center all the time shows that less than a quarter of all Americans are on Twitter, and of that, 80% of the tweets are done by 10% of the people. So when you see things trending, it's literally like less than 5% of the population. And yet so many people in traditional media, who I think are often more lazy than biased, buy into these little glimpses of reality instead of going out to America and talking to people. Most people in this country are optimistic. Most people are not nearly as polarized as we see. Yeah, do we get so around election time? I think so. But I just think there's still shared bonds. One of the things I love about our polling at Young America's Foundation, we poll college and high school students, and you set aside the some of the biases that you see in the media. Excuse me. The vast majority of college and high school students still believe in the American dream. They believe you work hard, even if you come here from somewhere else. That was an interesting question. Well, not just if you believe this, but do you believe that someone who comes here legally from another country, if they work hard, they play by the rules, can they succeed? Can they live the American dream? Overwhelmingly, yes. Yeah. And so there's good signs on there. Polling shows that there's more liberals than conservatives on most campuses in America, but that's not the number one answer. The number one answer is moderate. And I don't believe that's because they're moderate in policy. I believe they're just afraid of being labeled conservative. But in America, on most campuses, you're rewarded if you're a liberal. And so that gives us a good sign. They believe in fairness. We ask, should someone born a man be able to compete with someone born as a woman? 2/3 say no. Yeah. Should race be a factor, employment or enrollment in school? 2/3 say no, including almost the same percentages, black, Hispanic, or white, doesn't matter. What that tells me is our core, we believe in fairness. One of the problems oftentimes I think conservatives make is we think and talk with our head. The left thinks and talks with their heart. We need to keep thinking with our head. Don't lose the logic, but tell it in ways that come from the heart. We said the best teachers are ones who tell stories, and the best of all time was one who told parables.
No, that's really good. What, just as you speak tonight to students, and what message do you have? What leadership just qualities can people take away from Reagan? I think we're talking a lot about how President Reagan and his life and his leadership is still relevant today. Yeah. Many of us, I know, on this campus hold him as a role model. But what are some lessons you think we can take away from him?
Well, again, it's that we call him the happy warrior. I think about certain phrases you asked about before when you talked about the shining city on the hill. Again, it's appealing to that higher nature, appealing to our best hopes, not our greatest fears. And I think that's really powerful. Now, that means you talked about being an idealist. I'm an optimist, but with realistic expectations, right? So I don't live in a fantasy world. I don't think you do either. But so you can be a realist without being a cynic. You can say, here's what's really happening. Here's our real challenges. So we're not living in this fake world, but we can look at it, though, from an optimistic viewpoint of saying, I believe in the end that if given the right choices, I'll give you a good example. A few years ago after the 2022 election, I was highlighting how more than candidate quality, more than specific issues, because there were a lot of people saying, oh, it was poor candidates or it was abortion or whatever. I said, one, on that issue, I'm a pro-lifer. I said, every pro-lifer in America, governor and senator who was incumbent, won re-election overwhelmingly. It wasn't that issue. It's just an easy diversion by the media out there. So I said, what's the real factor? If you really look at the data, it was young voters. It was 18 to 29-year-old voters overwhelmingly. Here in Pennsylvania, in my state, in Wisconsin, they went to 30, 40 points or more. And I talked about how not just at YEF, but overall in the movement, we had to make inroads there. The interesting thing was one of the reporters said, so are you saying you're afraid of younger voters? I said, no, that's a great question. I said, I'm not saying I'm afraid of younger voters. I'm afraid of younger voters who only hear one side of the story. And so when I go back to what's the message is, we need to level the playing field. I believe in Americans in general, but I even believe in young Americans. If given the choice, the problem is I'm not mad at Generation Z. I'm mad at the rest of society who hasn't given them exposure to the history and background and understanding to make a true informed choice. Right now they're making a biased choice, but if given the chance to hear the facts, to know the history, to know what's involved here, I have great faith and optimism that overwhelmingly young Americans are going to aspire to make the best choice possible, and that's one that I think is more conservative than not.
Yeah, no, it's very encouraging to think about optimism. What do you think? Yeah, what's that message that we can continue to be sharing with our generation? I think for me, the first part of that is just to hear that optimism, especially around election time when we get a lot of fear and a lot of, you know what I know, especially as Christians, we're not to be fearful. But what else is a part of that? Maybe some of the what you're teaching at YAF and helping build this foundation. What's a part of that foundation?
Well, I think a good thing for people to do, whether it's looking at president, federal office, state office, or just local office, is there's a real difference out there. Not Republican, Democrat, not conservative, liberal, but more fundamental. And that is, do people put their faith in you, or do they put their faith in the government? You know, because if I say, I actually trust you, I think as long as you don't hurt the health and safety of your neighbor, I believe that you and your family and ultimately your belief in God should determine what's important in your life. Unfortunately, there's a lot of other people, and this to the extreme is what you get in communist societies where they block out God, where they, instead of saying, you know, God gives us our rights, you know, for a while we had in some places God and then a monarch and then, you know, the rest of us in little fiefdoms out there. In America, we got rid of the monarchy and just said our rights come from God. Which is inherent. There are some who are trying to wipe out God and have the government be the tell-all of all those things. And so I think it's just really important to say, where do any of these candidates, where do they believe power comes from? If they think it comes from them when they're in office, look out. If they think it comes from God and they're the ones to make sure that that's upheld, that those rights in a republic are protected, even for those that may not always agree with them, those are the candidates you want to drive towards.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think I've talked about with other people just how the reoccurrence of divine plan in the Reagan movie was just so wonderful to see, and the understanding that the president had that he was on this trajectory, the story that God had written for his life, and it wasn't.
And you look at great leaders. I mean, Lincoln, in the heart of the Civil War, was asked, you know, if he thought God was on the side of his noble cause. He said, it's not for me to ask God to be on my side, but rather for me to question whether I'm on his. You know, leaders like Reagan, like Lincoln, like others who've been great leaders for the entire country and arguably for the world, are leaders who ultimately put their faith in God and ask God to give them guidance as to what to do that's best. And I thank God literally all the time for Nell Reagan, his mother, because as much as anyone, she was the influence that as a Sunday school teacher, more importantly, as someone who lived her faith, who ministered to people in jail, who brought people in off the street, who gave her children that print of Udell, who stayed with him throughout his whole life to keep him focused on what was important. And you saw that time and time again. It's why Paul Kengard does such a great job, not just with The Crusader, but with God and Ronald Reagan, pieces of that being incorporated into the book. So powerful, because Ronald Reagan during his time in office didn't beat people over the head with it, but it was clearly the backbone of his belief system. And even in his outreach personally with Mikhail Gorbachev, he wasn't just convincing him to come to his side politically, but rather even ask about his faith and tried to witness to him.
Yeah, wow, that's really inspiring. Before we wrap up today, do you just where can people find the work you've talked about, YAF.org, but your work that you're doing in elsewhere?
Well, the fun stuff. So all of our conferences, our programs, our lectures. We do more conservative lectures than any other group in America.
Yes.
We broadcast all of that on social media. So the easiest way besides going to YAF.org is on YouTube. We have 1.7 million subscribers to our YouTube channel.
Awesome.
We just surpassed on all our platforms 1.4 billion views.
Wow.
But YAF TV. We just last night, for example, had Ben Shapiro at Cornell. So we're going to places that don't always welcome conservative voices, but we will go anywhere and everywhere to get the word out because, like I said, our young people deserve to be able to hear more than just one point of view.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We are looking forward to your lecture tonight, and we're so glad to have provided this for anyone who won't be able to be there tonight. But thank you for joining us, Governor Walker.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
For more information on Liberty Mail or the Institute for Faith and Freedom, visit faithandfreedom.com.